Roger, in your opinion, the importance of the relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare?
Well, what we know about them is that Anne Hathaway was born in 1556 and Shakespeare was born 8 years later in 1564. They lived in Stratford-on-Avon. When they got into a relationship or began to see each other, it's not quite clear, but by the time he was 18 and she was 26, they were pregnant. And sometime after that, they got married and they had their first child, and they had a couple of other children. The fact that she was that much older than him probably meant that she was reasonably mature, and him at the age of 18 or so as a young adolescent or older adolescent maybe. He seems to have learnt considerable amount of about life and female-male relationships from that relationship. So by the time he starts writing plays in 1590, it seems as if he's sorted out a philosophy for his plays based on their relationship, because we can only speculate really about what was going on in Stratford-on-Avon. But it's hard not to conclude that she was a huge influence on his life, and he did go back to Stratford-on-Avon and lived out his last years with her from about 1613 to 1616. And so even though other females are posited as being possible love interests of Shakespeare from reading of the plays and reading of the sonnets, it's incredibly obvious that Anne Hathaway was the main and possibly the only woman in his life, and was hugely influential in his understanding and eventually in the sort of writing that he did.
The relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare and its impact on his writings?
If we can presume that their time in Stratford was incredibly important for him and influential in developing him from a somewhat immature young man into a mature person, so by the time he started writing plays in 1590, he was 26 years old, and she by that time would have been 32 years old. The evidence that I see is that right from the start, the sonnet philosophy, which is published 20 years later in 1609, suffuses all his early works, so that you have to think that he had worked out his philosophy in the period of their relationship and then through the time they spent together in Stratford-on-Avon, so that when he went to London and started writing plays, if he started writing plays in London, every play from then on has evidence of the sonnet philosophy, and that sonnet philosophy is what gives his plays their groundedness and their depth of understanding and their incredible artistic impact or expression. So if you look at some of the early plays, like Love's Labour's Lost, for instance, it's about four women of France, a princess of France, and three ladies who visit the King of Navarre, and in the process completely correct the idealistic and over monastic expectations of four lords. So by the end of the play, the four lords are sent off to a form of punishment, just about, to recover from their mistakes and their unnecessary expectations of females. So it's a play that has no other source. Most of his plays come from some source or other, and he updates the source or corrects the source to make it more consistent with his philosophy. But Love's Labour's Lost is a play completely of his own devising. Not only that, a bit earlier than that actually, in 1593 and 1594, he wrote two long poems, the Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. Venus and Adonis, he changed out Ovid's emphasis on Adonis, as being the prime mover in that poem, and he supplants that with a Venus running the play, to the point where it can be considered to be an early version of the increase argument, which fills out the first 14 sonnets in the sonnet philosophy, published in 1609. And then in the Rape of Lucrece, he deals with the unexpected, possibly, but not unusual consequences of male-based imposition on females, to the point where Lucrece commits suicide. It has the unfortunate consequence in those days that the Tarquins, and Tarquin was a person who was attempting to rape her, the Tarquins were sent into exile, and the Roman Republic was instituted over the monarchy that was part of the Tarquin Empire.
Roger, the relationship between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare, its impact on the publication of the sonnets in 1609 and also the publication of the folio in 1623.
What we find is that in plays like Love's Labour's Lost, there's 4 sonnets. In Romeo and Juliet, there's some sonnets. And so Shakespeare was writing sonnets early in the 1590s. And there was a sonnet vogue at the time, and people were publishing groups of sonnets, numbered groups of sonnets. and people like Spencer and others. And so he's very well aware of the sonnet vogue. But by the time he came to publish his sonnets in 1609, it's as if he had organised and arranged and articulated them to present his philosophy, both structuring the female and the male into the sonnets, but also having a numbering system that elevates the numbering system used by other poets to something that's purely philosophical. So you'd have to think that through the late 1590s and early 1600s, he was working on the presentation of his philosophy in a set of sonnets. And when you look at the arrangement of the sonnets, you see 28 sonnets to the female and 126 sonnets to the male, and the whole set of sonnets, 154 sonnets, represents nature. And the female has a unity, and nature has a unity, but the male doesn't have a unity. He's one short of a unity. And so Shakespeare's ability, or the poet's ability in the sonnets, to instruct the young male in the increase argument, and the basis of the increase argument is that if no one increases at all, then the world will be done away, which is Shakespeare's words. It's not that everyone should increase, but if you were a pope, everyone was a pope, for instance, then that'd be the end of the world, because there'd be no increase left in the world. And that's the argument that Shakespeare's making.
So, Roger, that's the sonnets. What about the plays?
Well, it took me a while to work out the structuring of the sonnets. But when I did, I realised how profound, and it was a unique philosophy and the most comprehensive and consistent philosophy that's ever been penned by anybody, ever. By the time I started examining the plays more closely, what I began to see in the 1623 folio edition of the plays was that they were highly structured as well, that there are 14 comedies begin the 1623 folio, there are 10 histories, and then 12 tragedies. And surprise, surprise, the 11 of the comedies have female leads correcting male-based or masculine-based misunderstandings. And there are also 3 savvy feminine, masculine balanced males acting in those 14 comedies. When you move to the 10 histories and the 12 tragedies, Shakespeare's examining the male consequences of the male-based paradigm of the time, of the religious paradigm, and the consequences of that for the well-being and the murderous culture that developed both in the time of the English kings and through the tragedies whose plots he selects from various points in history and literature. What we also find is that in the introductory material to the 1623 folio, the 2 editors who are acting colleagues of Shakespeare, Hemmings and Condell, mention frequently that they are based on the true and original copies, and they're very scathing about editions that have come out before then that changed out Shakespeare's work. And of course the history of Shakespeare's scholarship is that there has been a huge number of changes made to Shakespeare's plays, and so the original plays from 1623 and the original sonnets even are the base material for any understanding of Shakespeare, and if anyone changes them out, all it says is they do not understand the philosophy. So by 1623, the colleagues have managed to edit and put together the volumes, and so we're fortunate that there are a number of copies of the 1623 folio still existing from that time, and we're also fortunate there are even 13 copies of the original sonnets existing from that time. So as a resource, amazing resource, if you want to go back to the originals. And what you find is that an incredible number of editors and academics get dissatisfied with their misunderstandings of Shakespeare and go back to the originals frequently. I was just fortunate, the way I came at Shakespeare, to go to the originals and see what he was attempting to say in terms of the philosophy about life and his understanding of art.
Roger, Shakespeare's later years and their relationship.
We know that he went back to Stratford-on-Avon around about 1613 or so, after he had written what chronologically was his last play, Henry VIII. And he wrote it quite late in his career because it's an incredibly critical play of the reign of Henry VIII and effectively the foundation of the Anglican Church, which was somewhat imposed upon the English people after he broke with Rome. So you'd have to imagine that the last 3 years he spent in Stratford-on-Avon with Anne Hathaway were really pleasant years for him. What he died of, we don't know particularly. But he did die at the age of 52, which in some ways was quite young. But she survived him and was alive and potentially in contact with the editors of the folio, because they based a lot of their material on the original copies, which may or may not be in her possession, for instance. I'm speculating, I know. But we do know that she died in 1623, which was the year in which the folio was published. So it seems quite significant, possibly, that the person who was the most influential person on Shakespeare, the person who grounded him when he was a young man, taught him maturity and led him to understand the relationship between life and effectively his artistic expectations and artistic capabilities, to develop into the most amazing playwright that the world has ever known, and even the most amazing sonneteer that the world has ever known, to the point that really no one has quite grasped his philosophy and what he's on about. And that's my claim, I suppose, is that somehow or other I've been able to do that. And it's just amazing to be able to read through the whole of the 1623 folio, to read the original 1609 sonnets, and to sense this amazing presence of both of them, both Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare, in those works, as a living unit representing female and male for us in the world, especially in this global world.